I'm Regen Ray, and today we're going to dig deep in soils with Bryan, joining us from New Zealand. How you going, Bryan?
Very good, sir. Yourself?
Yeah, good. Always learning and digging deeper, and I'm excited to have a chat and hear about your history. Share with the community what got you started with soil.
Well, I was brought up on a dairy farm in New Zealand, near a little town called Putaruru, which is a volcanic area and a very interesting area for dairying because it was in the 1920s and 30s before my time, but cattle suffered from what was called bush sickness. And so farmers were actually given land to try and farm it, but it's actually, in a long story short, it was actually discovered to be a cobalt deficiency, which in Australia is sometimes called a coastal disease. And once it was actually discovered, and what got me interested, of course, was because farmers after the Second World War were using certain types of cheaper fertilisers, and the people that used the cheaper fertiliser didn't have bush sickness, and they were able to isolate out that cobalt was the missing element. And then I was very interested in agriculture right through. I loved animals, loved dairy cows, and after my high school, I went to Massey University for a couple of years and studied dairying. And one of the problems with going to university, you have higher expectations of yourself. And so after that, I went share milking, then farm ownership, excuse me, and then I looked for consulting jobs. But one of the problems in New Zealand, of course, or any country, is if you're not part of the academics fraternity, then those opportunities don't come around unless you start up by yourself. So I was able to join an organisation and started consulting, and we were consulting in soil, plant and animal nutrition and the association between soil and plants and the resulting animals. And so it became a very interesting challenge. I travelled to many parts of New Zealand, and then in the 1980s, I had the opportunity to go to South Australia and on a visit. And I caught up with a Rural Youth Exchange member. He was a Grantley Dodd, and Grantley was well known in South Australia. He's passed away now, and he invited me to come back and do more work in South Australia. So it was a very interesting challenge. When you take ideas from one land to another, and they're totally different, it's quite a challenge because you know the idea is when you move from one country to another, you should respect the ideas in that country first before you start practicing them. So I didn't do any of that. I just started practicing what I knew and working with orchardists in the Adelaide Hills and et cetera, and dairy farmers on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and we were getting very good results. I was then invited to consult for a company in Perth, and they had franchisees, 80 franchisees all around Australia. And I actually travelled through Western Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, running workshops under the Farm Biz scheme. And that gave me a great insight into the different soils around Australia. And, you know, people don't realise the difference between the states and the soil compositions. And then I was also invited to go to China, and ended up in China with a soil testing laboratory in a place called Kaifeng in China. And so that was a great insight into the soils in China. And then more recent time, I was contacted over the internet, and I ended up working in Japan as well. So looking at soils in Japan, and then you slowly can put all these soils together, because wherever you go, the soils can be totally different. And it's just been a great adventure working with soils and seeing how you can change a soil and change animal behaviour, change plant nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of stories there to put together, but there's been some great results. And I think from a regenerative farming point of view, I was working with a grower up in Northern Territory. I never ever visited there, but he actually told me that after 2 years, he had reduced his spray bill by $800,000. Wow. So he must have had a big spray bill. But just showing you how if you change the soil, you can change the quality of the plant, you change the way that the predators attack the plant, and you can get a better quality product. And so, yeah, so I've done work in South Africa and many other, Vietnam, and Samoa, but I haven't visited all those areas. But I've been asked to comment on soils in those, and Holland, and
so you've travelled the world.
I haven't actually visited all those countries. It's just
soils.
the internet is a great thing, and so I've had a lot of contacts and had a lot of invites, and a lot of fantastic results just by looking after the soil and changing the soil.
Yeah, I love that. I've always enjoyed our chats that we've had in the past as well, and some of the content that you've created on our Soil Learning Centre and for our members. And I've really always had those kind of mind-blowing understandings around that. I want to touch on a point that you made, that you started researching the connection between soil, plant health, and animal health. Do you remember what year that was, roughly?
Well, that was in when I started working in 1978 and 1980. And one of the fascinating things is that one of my dairy farmers that became a client in 1978, he is still a client today. And so every year I've done his soil tests since 1978, and he just follows my advice, and he can't understand why his farm's still green in the summertime and now the neighbours are going brown. But he's a very low-key farmer, but he's the most profitable farmer in the district, according to his local bank manager.
Wow. And so that's really cool too, in the fact that he doesn't have to understand how it works. It just works, and that's really, 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 really cool. What's your thoughts on the fact that you've been looking at this since, say, the late 70s, early 80s, and we're now 2021, and we're still having to try and convince people that this is the way to farm and the way to nurture our soils? Are you seeing hope there, or are you frustrated some days that it's taking so long to see what's so clearly obvious?
It does get frustrating because, I think Japan was a great adventure, because I went there to problem solve, because one of the issues in the world is when a farmer plants his seed and the crop fails, he wants to blame the seed. And so this importer seed importer in Japan, who was the pioneer seed importer, he was having problems with clients blaming the seed. But I was able to quickly show his clients that it was nothing to do with the seed. It was their bad fertiliser programs, which had been advocated by the local fertiliser suppliers. And a lot of them are very knowledgeable people. But when you're looking at soil balance, and we talked about the pH, understanding pH, and that puts a whole new bend on things. And the other one was that I've worked with a lot, and it's probably a bit controversial, is in Japan they used a lot of compost, cow manure, rice husks, and that was a really eye-opener to seeing the excess compost being applied was actually quite detrimental to the crop, because the biology in the soil couldn't handle all that excess compost. And we've talked about before, compost is actually a fertiliser, and so it has a big nutrient content. So because they were using cow manure, which is very high in potassium and phosphorus, that was actually suppressing things like manganese and magnesium. And so it was actually because they were using it so continuously and so such a long period of time, it was causing major issues in the soil and creating a very bad soil. Not saying compost is bad, but it's just understanding that the wrong compost can be bad for your soil.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the things that I took away from chatting and hanging out with you, was the fact that sometimes people get excited when they put an input, or even it could be organic or natural, and they get good results. They think that if they put more of it on, that's a good thing. And your highlighting of excessive means is sometimes worse than a lack reading. And so that was a real eye-opener from my world, especially coming from tech and startup where everything's bigger and faster and better. That mentality might not, and it doesn't work with nature.
And that's the other thing is the frustration is there, because I see a lot of the working with dairy herds and with sheep and et cetera, and large, like an example, a large farm on Kangaroo Island was 10,000 sheep, and they had a 60% lambing percentage. Now, I did what you sort of did, the technical thing. We tested the soil, we tested the pasture, and we knew the blood tests, and the animals were just extremely low in selenium. The soil was low in selenium. And so at that time, there was no selenium fertiliser available in Australia. There is now, of course. And so we imported some from New Zealand and applied it to the property, but we made the mistake, we just applied it to the grassland. Now, the great thing that happened was the first year after we applied the selenium, his lambing percentage jumped from 60% to 110%. And that was just by addressing that one limiting factor. Then what happened was when he weaned the lambs, he weaned them onto his stubble country. And the stubble was just stubble. And of course, they immediately went into a selenium deficit.
Wow.
Because we'd only applied it to the pasture. So the learning curve was that, so next year we applied it to all the cropping ground as well. And when the lambs were weaned, there was no selenium deficiency. The dead stalks contained enough selenium to maintain them and give a great result. So those are little learning things that we must be careful and understand. And so there's some of the frustrations I have, as you mentioned now, of course, is I see the same things in human nutrition. We're getting to the point where plants, of course, according to the FDA in America, Food and Drug Association, the vegetables we're growing today have 30% less nutrient value than they did 30 years ago. There's two reasons for that, of course, and the same happens with pastures. And this is where your multiple species comes in, because pastures are being grown or bred for volume. And vegetables are being bred for volume and quick maturity.
Yep.
And so as you grow a plant faster, whether it's for animals or humans, you dilute the nutrients which it contains. So you've got a dilution problem in those vegetables and in that pasture. So situations like New Zealand, for instance, where we're growing lots of grass for milking cows, we now have the situation where the majority of dairy farmers, of course, are feeding about 300 or 400 grams of minerals per head per day as a supplement. Because when I was young and growing on the farm, there was none of that. But the species today are growing so much more dry matter. We're getting up to 18,000 kilos, 18 tonne of grass per hectare being grown in some areas, whereas the average is about 12 or 14 tonne. And so as we increase that and we use more nitrogenous fertilisers, we're creating dilution.
Yep.
And that's really what we need to understand with our fruit. Fruit's not a problem because fruit's grown in a slower environment. So, but as we grow multiple species, those multiple species, of course, is like having what they advertise in Australia, your 7 plus a day of vegetables. And the reason you have 7 plus a day of vegetables because every vegetable planted in the same soil or every grass species planted in the same soil extracts different levels of nutrients from that soil. And that's with your multiple species. One of the issues I've seen with the multiple species, though, some of your photographs is there's a lot of bare ground there that needs to be filled with something. And a lot of grazing, there's a lot of trash left on the ground. Of course, that trash that's left on the ground, of course, oxidizes, it goes to the atmosphere. But there was a lot of frustration when I hear the animal health, the human health issues we have today, the majority of them could be cured with diet. Because you can go into a herd of cows. I went into a herd of cows in an area here in New Zealand a couple of years back, and the young calves were lasting about 7 days and then they were dying. So they had a veterinarian looking after the calves, trying to find out what the problem was. When we walked around the herd of cows, the dung was a funny colour. The cows didn't look quite right. And on analysis, we found out in this particular case, the crop they were feeding was very low in protein and very low in phosphorus. Now, fodder beet is a crop. I don't know how much is grown in Australia, but it's a very popular crop here in New Zealand for wintering on because it has a great volume of product. But it's very low in phosphorus and very low in protein. So we introduced more protein into the diet by the form of grass silage and some oats. And, within a week or so, there was none of the calves were dying.
Yeah. It's just amazing that we've just moved every system into like quantity rather than quality.
Yes.
It's just such a bad metric to say that we're growing more or we're creating more of something, or we fast track the growth rate by X%, and no one's actually stopping to look at the nutritional value, the taste, the aroma, the texture, and then it just means we need to buy more. So instead of eating 2 carrots and feeling full, we're now having to eat 4 carrots. So sometimes when we have this dilemma of feeding the world, my kind of thoughts are, do we just need to slow down, grow better quality food, and do we just all eat less volume and high quality protein, high quality food that nourishes the body and the soul, rather than just eating because we're told seven a day, 6 times a day, so it's the
That's what you talk about. So we talk about higher quality protein. So what is higher quality protein? See, a lot of work done in Australia on human nutrition shows that the worst vegetables for nutrition are rocket, cos lettuce, and spinach.
Wow.
The reason being is they're very high protein. People always think they're getting the protein from meat. But those vegetables, of course, are running about 35, 40% protein, because protein is nitrogen multiplied by 6.25. And that's because there's 16.5% nitrogen in protein. So 16 multiplied by 6.25 equals 100. So, and so people don't understand that. And of course, those vegetables, those bags of fresh leafy vegetables, the nitrate levels in them are very high. And nitrate protein is toxic protein. It's toxic to animals. It's got to be toxic to humans. But anyway, so that's one of my frustrations is that because in animals I had a herd of cows in Brisbane and Queensland. The farmer rang me and he said every cow that was calving was having a dead calf, it was stillborn. And I said to him, "What are you grazing fresh growing lucerne?" He said, "Yes, I am." I said, "Well, fresh growing lucerne is extremely high in nitrate protein." So we changed the diet, and a week later he rang me and says, "All the calves are being born alive now."
Wow.
And that's just diet, changing diet. And that's what your multiple species are doing, is you're giving lots of different opportunities of different mineral status. I mean, one of the issues in China was that if someone had been to China, the area of land in China is called a mu, and there's 15 mu to 1 hectare. And they used to grow about, to get it right, used to grow about 70 or 80 or 90 kilos of grain per mu. They're now growing 900 kilos per mu. So it's about 1.5 tonne or whatever per hectare. And the reason, and now they're finding, of course, they're doing an investigation when I was there a few years ago on why the wheat now is so low in vitamin B. And I said to them, what the dilution factor? And they hadn't really thought about that. And that's really what we're getting at. We're getting that dilution factor.
And understanding that is then making better decisions, asking better questions. This is why educating and understanding how the system works, even just understanding how our own bodies work. And, just your example, like I read an article a couple of weeks ago about the fact that anything that gets called a superfood starts diminishing being a superfood, because it then starts getting such high demand that the growers have to grow more, not quality. And so the superfood attributes of it get lost very quickly. So it's actually better to eat non-superfoods because they're growing slower. No one wants them. The farmer's keeping them in the ground longer. They're getting better nutrient values, and you're eating better quality food. So all this marketing stuff that encourages us to eat more, faster and quicker is just what's actually degrading our own body health and the ecosystem.
But we can combat that, though. We don't have to, because that's where if the farmer is doing his basic soil test to start with and correcting the nutrient deficiencies, because one of the things that I sort of take, I guess, exception with is that people think the farmers have destroyed the soil. But there were very few soils, like in Australia, that were capable of producing good crops originally. Because in Australia, you've got high potassium soils in New South Wales. So the crops there are very high in potassium, and they lodge and they don't fruit well as they should. In Victoria, we had very acidic soils. In South Australia, you've got the high magnesium soils, which lack air in the soil. And in Western Australia, you've got these sandy soils, which are very low in potassium, very low in calcium, and very low in manganese. And of course, when the farmers I was working with the university over there many years ago. One of the lecturers, his name was Mohammed, and he was wondering why, when he put lime on the West Australian soils, the crops failed. Now the soil test showed they need lime, but what's happened when he put the lime on? He suppressed the manganese. And the lack of manganese caused the crop failure. So it's a matter of looking at all the limiting factors.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where your soil testing
creates another, you got to understand all the pieces of the whole rather than just looking at one piece of the puzzle.
So if you're going to put lime on a soil, and your members need to watch this one, If you're going to put lime on a soil, you need to know what your manganese status is. And if your manganese status is very low, you will create a manganese deficiency in the crop, and the crop will lodge. And that's a common on Kangaroo Island. I'm working with farmers on Kangaroo Island. Once we limed the soil, their crops could go backwards. But if you sprayed the crop with manganese when it was growing, there was no problem. But if you didn't spray it with manganese, you had a problem. So we need to be aware that when we're looking at soils, we've got to look at the soil test, the plant test, and then make sure our fertiliser, whether it's compost or whether it's coming from a fertiliser company, whatever, you got to make sure that fertiliser is matching those limiting factors in that soil.
Yeah,
and that's a big thing around the world. I mean, in Japan, for instance, I was a farmer. We did some tests where I had excess magnesium. Now he was asking the client, the fertiliser company, for lime, but they didn't have lime; they had dolomite. So they were selling him dolomite on his high magnesium soil, and dolomite is calcium and magnesium. So he was actually exaggerating his problem because the fertiliser company was supplying him with the wrong product.
Wow.
And that's where all these your clients need to know that not only do they need to be able to understand their soil tests, they need to be able to check that the fertiliser company is giving them the right product. And that's a great thing, big thing in the world today, is understanding and being able to question Dr. Albrecht, who I follow his findings. He always said you must be able to test the soil tester.
And how do you do that?
By understanding your soil report.
Yes.
And that's the important issue there. And you can just, soils are so fantastic. I mean, you can manipulate that soil to do what you like. You can restore the soil, or you can cause degeneration just with your fertiliser program.
Yep. And that's really hard for some people to hear, because they feel like they're doing the right thing, but they don't realize that underlying they're actually causing more damage than good. And it's by no fault of anyone, apart from just a lot of people don't know how this soil functions, and this is why I've gone down this path and this journey of just learning and digging deeper into soils to learn as much as I can, because it is about sometimes self-education, like what you said before, test the soil tester. I think that's a really good point to make, and we probably need to do that in a lot of parts of our world. We don't just take the data verbatim, say who's saying what, why are they saying that, who funded that research, where is this data coming from, what narrative is it trying to support or not support.
See, one of the big problems in New Zealand pasture is low magnesium, but our soils originally were high magnesium. But what's happened is people have been liming for pH. So when the pH is low, you put on lime to raise the pH. But the first thing lime does, of course, it knocks out magnesium. And so we're getting our magnesium going from, say, soils that were maybe 15% base saturation, they're down to 6% base saturation, which is too low for healthy pasture growth. Mm-hmm. So a lot of farmers now are switching to dolomite. And dolomite, of course, is magnesium and calcium. Now in Australia, you've got many, many sources of dolomite, especially in South Australia, and I think in New South and in Victoria. But in New Zealand, we've only got one source of dolomite, and that's at the top of the South Island. There's a dolomite mine. That's the only one in New Zealand. So dolomite becomes a very expensive lime source when you're trucking it, the length of the country. But even using small amounts of it is giving fantastic results in stock health. Just by increasing the magnesium percentage in the soil, you're increasing the magnesium in the pasture. And so it's understanding what you've been saying. When you put on one element, if you do too much of it, you're going to suppress another. Yeah. And that's where you need to be aware. I mean, you get into the bottom end of the York Peninsula in South Australia, where the soils are 90% base saturation calcium. And a crop grows there, and the crop will just go yellow. And you spray it with manganese, and it flourishes. Because on those high calcium soils, there's no manganese in the soil, so the crop just goes yellow from lack of manganese, and it'll just collapse and die. But one spray of manganese sulfate, and it's wonderful. There's this understanding that there's such a close. People talk about organic farming, but there's such a close relationship in organics. I mean, you can't just take a farm and become an organic. You've got to actually address all these issues as well. And I've been working with many organic farmers over the years, and it's just so interesting to be able to change the quality of their crops. And you can't, if you have a good, well-balanced soil for organics, you can't tell the difference between looking at an apple from an organic farm and looking at a conventional. They both look as good.
Yep. Looks can be deceiving. And you've mentioned this a couple of times about regenerating the soil or restoring the soil. I'm curious from your point of view and visiting via the soil so many parts of the world, what does the word regenerative mean to you?
Well, I guess I find we've got to be move from idealistic to be realistic and understand. And true regenerative farming is understanding, taking soil samples and a good soil sample. And you've got a lot of your clients doing soil samples, and some of your members that you've had talking on your talk shows is understanding the soil, taking good soil tests, understanding, and before you do anything, is putting on the limiting factors for that soil and understanding what they are. As we talked about, compost can be good or bad. So we have good ones for this soil, but might be good for another soil, and it might be bad for this soil. But true regenerative farming is bringing the soil back to its natural, not bringing it back, is creating a natural soil. Because if we look at Dr. Ulbrich with his work, what he did was he went to soils around the world that were naturally fertile. And there was some of the areas of South Africa, the prairie plains in America, and some parts of Europe. And then he found the soils with their ideal, animal health was good, and et cetera, et cetera. And then he replicated those soils. And that's what I'm saying. And it sounds like working extensively in South Australia, you've got these massive magnesium soils. And the trees there, of course, in some areas, once the tree gets high, it just falls over because the root system is just sitting on the surface because there's no air in the soil. And so regenerative is taking a soil and making it, I was going to say making it perfect, but maybe not quite perfect, but making it as perfect as possible. And you can do that with your soil as long as you're doing your basic soil tests. And make sure you're doing all, like here in New Zealand, some of the soil testing fertiliser companies offer a free test, but it's a very basic test. It doesn't cover all the options. So you need to make sure you're getting a soil test, which you can pay a bit more for, get everything tested, and then understanding the importance of all those elements. And then your plant tests. So making sure your plant's nutriently testing okay. But I always say to people, you can't soil test from plant test, because a plant test is showing you what the soil's allowing that plant to uptake. So if you've got a bad soil, people say to me, why doesn't this plant test look like the soil test? Well, they never will. Because the plant is taking up what the soil balance is allowing that plant to take up. And then, of course, if you come in and if you're growing a good crop, you can come in, you can spray nutrients on that crop. And it's understanding the importance of those nutrients, because most of the nutrients elements you can spray onto the crop are considered organic, like all the sulfates are organic. Boron, because there's no naturally organic boron, boron is allowed to be, and boron is a natural product anyway, but you're allowed to, in organic farms, to spray boron. So that becomes a critical element as well. And I guess when I look at what I've been doing over the last 40, 50 years, is actually regenerative soil. And it just fascinates me that, because when I started doing what's happening today, I was considered a quack. It was quackery. And now it's becoming more and more accepted. But we need to think more deeply about what we're doing. I mean, one of the things I don't understand, and you might have been, I don't know if you've talked to Brenton yet, but is lack of cultivation. Because some soils, like high magnesium soils, you need to cultivate the lime into that soil. You can't just put it on top. It'll work eventually, but if you want to work a soil and get the microbes working in and the bacteria working, you've got to create a home for that soil. And if you build a home for your family when you first get married and you live in a little flat, and then you're going to have children, you've got to make a bigger house and you get a bigger car. So you're actually creating an environment for that family.
Yeah.
And you've got to do that with the bacteria in the soil too. You've got to create a home for those bacteria to flourish. And if you get a high magnesium soil or a high potassium soil, they'll struggle. I mean, the high calcium soils in South Australia, where they've done a lot of trials with microbes and et cetera, that it all fails, mainly because the high calcium soils, there's no airspace. Very powdery, there's no real structure. Yep. And so the high magnesium soils, there's no airspace. And so we can change that by introducing some calcium and et cetera, and introducing some air. And sometimes the problems with cultivation is there's a lot of over-cultivation and bad machinery. Some machinery will create pans in the soil.
Yep.
And so there's no air getting into the soil. So it's...
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there is really, really powerful, because I feel like sometimes coming from this space, you might learn a new technique like no-tilling or zero inputs, and we can get a little bit stuck on that and think that, obviously in this conversation you've spoken about, disturbing the soil to make the right environment, or, add in some inputs, whether it be a spray or some form of input. I feel like sometimes we pigeonhole regenerative agriculture into this principles, and we think on day one we must do all these principles 100% or it's not regenerative. And I think what you're highlighting, and what I've seen from your work and what you've shared on other programs, is that you got to do the right thing at the right time to make the soil better and get it close to perfect. Sometimes you need to cultivate that property. Sometimes you need to add an input, and it's about the journey of getting the soil where you need to get it to. And that comes with knowledge and understanding, your ability to know if you're going to put this input on it, are these other elements lined up to create the perfect environment? And I think that is really an important distinction, to do the right thing at the right time for the best interest of the soil today, not what you want your soil to be in 10 years' time.
Yeah, well, a lot of the modern machinery creates pans in the soil, like the power harrows. Yeah. They're terrible at creating a pan. And, we've got to avoid doing that. I mean, one of the issues with cultivation is living in South Australia. After when April, May, after all the cultivation, Adelaide would get covered in dust clouds, and when it rained, it would rain mud onto your car and your city, etc. But Albrecht was all about stimulating the biology in the soil. So if you're actually going to cultivate, what we recommend is putting some nitrogen on that soil first. And when you cultivate it, it stimulates the bacteria in the soil, and they multiply into trillions and decompose all the trash and form a nice, beautiful crumb structure. The excretions hold all those particles together. Now, I've had farmers tell me that the areas they cultivated with pre-plant nitrogen against the ones they didn't, and the only ones that blew with dust were the ones they didn't put the pre-plant nitrogen on. In other words, the ones that didn't have the bacteria or the microorganisms stimulated were the ones that blew. The ones that were stimulated, there was no blowing, the soil was perfect. And that's what regenerative agriculture is about, is getting those microorganisms going in the soil. And you can do that several ways. You can inject bugs into the soil to get the right ones. That can be successful or non-successful. In a lot of cases it is successful, but if you actually stimulate the ones that are there, you'll get the desired ones. And the most important thing is that the nitrogen and phosphorus availability in the soil is governed by the biological activity in that soil. So if you increase the biological activity, you get more available phosphorus and you get more available nitrogen, because they're dying bodies, which I think the life cycle is sort of 7 to 24 hours. Their dying bodies are actually supplying nitrogen to your crop. And so it's a very good way to get that soil working very quickly and to get that structure going. And so it's. I mean, when you go around to different parts of the world and I got faced with in Japan with asparagus coming up out of the ground. It looked like a banana, and you may have seen those photos, and which is a phosphorus deficiency. So the researchers were trying to solve why, because they had 1,000 parts per million of phosphorus in the soil, why it wasn't getting into the plant. The reason it wasn't getting into the plant is because they had a depth of compost plant, rice husks and cow manure this deep. And at the bottom it was decomposing. While that decomposition is going on, those organisms won't supply any nitrogen or phosphorus to that plant. So the plant's going phosphorus deficient, going nitrogen deficient. And so we actually had case where they couldn't, you can tell a farmer to take it all away, which I did on many cases, or we added extra nitrogen, which is probably one of those 4-letter bad words, but we added the extra nitrogen, within a week. The asparagus was coming up straight because the bacteria stimulating the microorganisms in the soil, they completed the decomposition very quickly and then started feeding the crop.
Fascinating. I have, the more I learn and the more I understand this, the more, I think sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but I think partnering with experts or mentors such as yourself who understand how these systems work is a great blessing for people to really partner with. I know that sometimes I talk to farmers and they're going to agronomists or their local ag shops, and they might not be educated to actually understand how some of the things that you've explained today function. So I think it's really important that people partner with other like-minded people such as yourself to give them a new view on what their soil tests are, what it's like, looking at all those parts and being able to identify that, look, this mineral is there, but because you're doing these other things, which is proactive, and kudos for you for doing it, but it's actually putting a negative effect for now. Then once we fix this or we balance it correctly, then we can continue with that practice. I think that's a really a distinction that we need to kind of make and understand. And we're not expected to know everything about all the systems. We don't understand even how our own body biology works, let alone should we know how the soil one works. That's why we go to doctors and others who are able to understand that and look at our bloods and make assumptions from that. And we've got to treat our soils the same.
And one of my first challenges, I was in 1980s, I was invited to go to Western Samoa in the Pacific, and we did some soil tests there, and they came back at 40% base saturation magnesium and about 20% calcium, which I'd never seen that before because the pHs were all in the 8s, but high pH, but very low calcium. And of course, those days there was no internet. So we had a service in New Zealand where you could go to the local research centre and pay a fee of about $100, and they would send your questions to a university around the world that could answer the question. Wow. And that would take 1 or 2 or 3 weeks to get an answer. And then I came back with the high magnesium soils, and of course Samoan soils are very old soils, the same as the central red soils in Australia. And they matched the two of them together as being about the same age, and then explained the situation of high magnesium. But there's those challenges that just teach you more all the time. And that's the real fascinating thing about soils, is being able to take those soils and say, well, we've got this problem, how can we fix it? And we fix it. Yep.
And now we can jump on a Zoom call and do a virtual consult from anywhere around the world and solve problems quicker than ever. So I love that. I think we could talk about soils and your knowledge for days. One of the questions that I'd love to ask all guests on the show is, if you were the soil, what would you say to us on the planet? Can you be the voice of our soils for a moment?
Tread carefully. Understand me and look after me. Treat me like your child. Understand me and be gentle. Understand my needs and understand what I can do for you. I mean, soil is worth more than all the gold in the world because that's what that keeps the planet alive. And there is some misunderstandings, of course. The objective is to get the microorganisms going in the soil. And of course, to get them going, we need a home, and we have to create that home. So the soil is saying to us, create a home for us, create somewhere we can work together, and understand me, and listen to me.
Yeah.
Because when you walk across a paddock, and you see and you'll see it in some areas, you'll see some cow pads that are just drying out. And they're still there months after the cattle were grazed. You know that soil's dead. There's no life in the soil. Yeah. You can walk across a paddock, and what I do, I used to, in Young Farmers Club in New Zealand, we used to judge pastures. And I managed to come second in New Zealand in 1 year for judging pastures, but that's no big deal. But the fact is, you would look for the bare ground. What percentage of bare ground is here? What variety of species are growing here? And how can we improve that? If there's bare ground there's a problem. If you're grazing your pastures too long, you'll create bare ground. Because what's happening is that the plants are shading out, the big plants are shading out the little plants. And so, the soil's saying, help me get some more plants. And so it's a matter of, if the soil's all wet and there's no drainage, why am I in a bed of water? Yeah. Why you've got to keep me dry and warm. And, there's all those sort of things that the soil can walk across. I mean, when you walk through a herd of animals, you can look at, and the animals can talk to you whether they're healthy or not. And, I've seen, you walk to, and of course, I don't know, you see a bit of it in Australia now with endophytes in the grasses. You walk through a young mob, young stock, and they'll move and then start falling over in the autumn time with the endophyte poisoning. And I've seen herds of cows falling over. So what are you going to do about it? How can you help me? So there's all those issues that you've just got to walk and let the soil and the animals and the plants talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all for too long the soil has been out of sight and out of mind. And that was the reason for starting this podcast, is to bring this topic of soil top of mind for everyone and give it a voice. And I love what you just shared there. I want to just reinforce it, is like, tread lighter, treat me like your child, because I am worth more than gold. I think that is just perfect voice of the soil. So I think, soil lovers, when you're out in your paddocks this week, today, tomorrow, whenever you get a chance, just think about that in the back of your mind and listen to the soil and treat it. It is your child that is worth more than gold, and tread lightly. I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. Thanks, Bryan, for coming along and sharing all your gold nuggets with your soil wisdom. I always love hanging out with you and sharing and talking soil. If our soil loving community wanted to hang out with you more, what ways can they hang out with you?
Well, I guess they have my email. It's quite easy. I'm quite happy to answer questions, and I do a lot of voluntary work now for people with soils, and it's a subject which is I guess you look at the grey hair that's been around for a long time. 40, 50 years ago, I didn't know a lot, but as you work and look at soils, your knowledge just grows, and you just have to accept this extra life that's coming out of the ground. And I always tell people, out of one handful of soil, there's more life than there is people in the world.
Yes.
And you have to understand that when you walk past a garden and you walk down the lawn, you just admire that piece of soil because you know there's so much life in it.
Yep, love that. And we treat it like dirt, unfortunately. So we need to change that narrative. And the email to get in contact with you will be around the show notes or around the video that you're watching. I can be a testament that Bryan has helped our members in the Soil Learning Centre tremendously and come onto our virtual classrooms and shared soil tests. He's even helped with my own dad's veggie patch soil test analysis. And we use that as a case study in one of our virtual classrooms. So definitely someone with lots of knowledge and a heart of gold, and gives that knowledge to us all as a gift. So I really want to appreciate and acknowledge your expertise and guidance that you've given a lot of our members and even my own father. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you, Bryan, today. I love digging deeper with yourself and with all our community. So soil lovers, if you're out there listening, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into your soils. I'm Regen Ray for Farming Secrets. Well, soil lovers, that's enough secrets for one episode. I really hope that you enjoyed all the secrets shared during this conversation. But hey, let's not keep it a secret. Please share this podcast around and make sure that you like it and leave us a review, because that really helps spread the secrets of the soil. Until next time, remember, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into your soils.